Hello, thank you for tuning into this presentation on Zero Bias AI. Zero Bias AI. My name is Pramod Kunju. My friends call me Data Guru. I wear that as an honor. I've been in the data analytics and AI space for more than 20 years. On Nakunj Inc., we are a boutique consulting company specializing in AI and data analytics. So glad to be here with you today on this very important topic. One of the main reasons why I'm personally very interested in Zero Bias AI is because I'm also pursuing a graduate degree in criminal science. AI, as you may know, is being widely used in criminal. You have to be very careful when you use the technology, any technology in criminal. And that made me dig deeper into the use of AI, not just in criminal justice, but broadly across the areas of our life. For example, mortgage processing. Go to the bank, you apply for a mortgage. More than likely, there is a machine learning algorithm sitting at the back evaluating your application. So go to a stadium, a large soccer stadium with tens of thousands of people watching a game. You can bet that there are facial recognition systems in place in the stadium, especially in countries such as the United States or European countries, AI and technology. Facial recognition is one of the. Again, the intent there is to identify possible suspects in a crowded place, such as a soccer stadium, and you can imagine the impact of such decision making. Another simple example that we can all relate to is you go to an airport and some people are randomly selected for screening. Now again, we can assume that there is an AI system, AI technology, there is machine learning algorithms working behind the scenes to determine who needs to be pulled over for extra screening. So these are all simple examples of how AI can impact our daily lives, you and I, and what makes this a very important topic, bias in AI. If you know anything about AI, or if you don't, I'll give you a quick overview of how machine learning works. Essentially, machine learning works by looking at past data. It's looking for patterns in past data. And then it makes a prediction about what is going to happen in the future. Now, let's continue our exploration of criminal justice, where, let's say, somebody has been accused of committing a crime. He or she is brought to the criminal justice system, and now you have to determine the length of sentencing for their. Now, in this case, let's say that there is an artificial intelligence program, a machine learning algorithm that is assisting police, or in this case, the courts or corrections, to make the decision. Corrections means prison system. To make the determination of how long somebody needs to be sentenced for a particular crime. Now, if a machine is being asked to make this decision, what's it going to do? We look at all the past data of people who have committed similar crimes and how long they were sentenced for. So if there is inequity in criminal justice in the real world, in real life, let's say for example's sake, people of a certain race get longer sentences compared to people belonging to some other race, for example. Now, the AI system is going to believe that as its truth because it has nowhere else to go. He's looking at data that's presented to you, to, to that system, and making decisions based on that. So in this scenario, it is possible that somebody belonging to the race that historically has gotten longer sentencing terms. Let's say somebody belonging to a certain race used to be in prison for 1 year versus 8 months for a person belonging to a different race. Again, we all know that criminal justice tries to be equitable. So there is this whole concept of fairness in criminal justice. There is what's called horizontal fairness and vertical fairness. For example, two people committing similar crime should receive similar punishment. So that's one aspect of fairness. Another aspect of fairness is somebody committing a more severe crime, for example, a bicycle theft versus somebody committing a homicide. Now, those are varying degrees of crime, and fairness principle means that the person committing a more severe crime will get a more severe punishment. So, with all that aside, when AI looks at historical data and it sees that people of certain race tend to commit more crimes, so they deserve longer sentencing just because of the historical data that's presented to the algorithms, that can lead to bias. And now we're talking about decisions that can impact people's lives, even including if somebody should be sentenced and how long they should be sentenced for. So that's why it's very critical that we evaluate the right application of AI. We want to make sure that there is zero bias. That should be our mission. But at the minimum, we should be working towards eliminating bias one by one. And throughout this presentation, I'll be calling out some of the well-established biases that may be present in the world of artificial intelligence. And I will also provide some recommendations how we can overcome those biases, how, as practitioners of AI and as people looking out for one another, and as people who believe in fairness, not just in criminal justice, but in all aspects of life, how we can really make a change when it comes to AI. Because sooner or later, as we all know, AI, I mean, there are talks about AI is going to take over the world, humans are going to be slaves of AI. I don't really believe in that. There are not many people who believe in that kind of a futuristic vision. However, everyone accepts that AI is here to stay. AI is being widely adopted in many countries. We have self-driving cars today, which are becoming more and more prominent on our streets and more popular. People are increasingly subscribing to the idea that cars can be self-driven, which even a few years ago had been a thing of science fiction. Not many people really believe that cars could drive by themselves or by itself, I should say. So AI is certainly being adopted at a very rapid scale. There is no question about that. That's even more important reason why we should be looking at how biased can an AI system be. And if an AI system is biased, is it fair to use that to make decisions that can impact people's lives? Those are very important questions. Those are very important social questions, also legal questions, ethical questions that need when AI is becoming more and more prominent and prevalent. So with that background, I'm going to walk through some of the slides that I put together to illustrate, first of all, what exactly it means to have bias in AI, and then going on to make some recommendations how we can eliminate. Some more background here. Rapid development in AI of course, it holds a lot of promise, again, with pitfalls, of which I've already walked through. Now, a lot of us who have come from the data field, we have heard this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. And that kind of accurately describes what AI systems do as well. Feeding AI systems with data, historical data, and what comes out of the AI system as a result, if it's predicting, for example, a result of a mortgage application. So that's totally dependent on the data set that goes into the AI system. So garbage in, garbage out, something all of us have heard before in the data domain, that holds true when it comes to artificial intelligence. Again, when we're talking about AI bias, we are talking about systemically prejudiced results. I know that is a complex phrase to explain, but it's systemic in the sense that it was widespread and prejudiced because you are making decisions based on past data, which by definition is most likely prejudiced because of the reality in which we live in. So there can be erroneous and flawed assumptions in the machine learning process that can result in bias in artificial intelligence. Now, what are some of the reasons for the bias in artificial intelligence? One of the key points that I want to highlight here, I'm not going to read through all the content on all the slides. We'll be making these slides available. I'll be highlighting a few key points on each of these slides. So here I want to focus attention on non-representative data set. That's really the key. If you're using a data set for AI, which doesn't represent the entire population, then you begin to see bias. And this is downly true, and all of us can relate to this. For example, if you are building an AI model based on only one race that's prominent in the population, if 90% of your data set belongs to that race, and 10% belongs to other races, whereas in the real world, that race that contributes 90% probably only 30 to 40%. So it's non-representative of the general population. And then you use those AI models to make predictions, make decisions on the general population. And that's a scenario where bias is likely to occur because you just do not have a representative sample of the population. There can also be human errors. From the machine learning background, you are familiar with what's called data labeling. There is now it is more and more automated as we speak. However, there is still manual intervention, and that can result in developing bias. Some technical aspects to biases in AI. There are 5 major types of bias that you can look at. There's data set bias, and I will go over this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Data set bias, automation bias, association bias, confirmation bias, and interaction bias. So these are generally considered the 5 major types of bias in AI. So you can already see that bias in AI is actually quite well documented. We have to give credit to people who have done it. They have already documented the different types of bias that are possible in AI, even though they themselves may be AI practitioners, they may be exponents, maybe advocates of AI, they promote it actively. However, they also realize that inherently there may be bias in AI, more so than any other technologies that we have been exposed in them. As we use data analytics, and you may make the argument that data analytics in general can have biases because you're only working with a limited set of data. may not be representative of the whole population. Very similar to what we saw on the earlier. So now we're going to look at some more details on what each of these biases represents. Data set bias. So we have already seen this two homogeneous small data set. Example that we looked at earlier was one race disproportionately represented in the data set when in real life that race is probably a small percentage of the overall population. Association bias. So this one is interesting. An example of this could be when people are looking for jobs and they're searching on Google or any such application. There is a tendency that jobs with higher pay are shown to people who are basically male. So if you are marked as gender as male, you're likely to see jobs with higher pay than the advertisements or jobs that are shown to female candidates. Unfortunate, and that can be an example of association bias. Automation bias, an example there would be when you are a beauty pageant and you're researching that. Oftentimes you get recommendations for lighter skin tone versus darker skin tone. That can be an example of an automation. Interaction bias, you may have heard about Microsoft's chatbot. It was called Tay. It was released with a lot of fanfare, but shut down in about 24 hours as people started interacting with that bot and people actually started teaching it racial slurs. Microsoft had to shut it down within a period of time. Confirmation bias, all of us have already seen that is a scenario where, for example, when you're shopping for something, that you can maybe. Now, how do you get rid of the bias in AI? And around what will be some of the key recommendations, knowing that there could be bias that creeps into the application that you're building within AI. Clearly, you need to consider bias and selecting the training data set. Those in the machine learning world are very familiar with training data set. That's how you train your AI models before you deploy them into production. Before a mortgage application algorithm is put into production and actually used to evaluate mortgage applications in a bank, it needs to be trained, it needs to be tested, and that training data set is going to be very crucial in making sure that there is no bias or less bias. I would almost argue that the amount of bias in AI on day one versus as you progress in a maturity scale, it should come down exponentially. I would also argue that you really don't, there is a tendency for many companies, especially software companies, to release version 1 of the software and there may be known issues or known bugs that are published as part of the release documents. Well, it may work for some of the software applications. However, when it comes to AI, I think companies need to be more responsible, especially if it is AI that's impacting people's lives, their ability to secure a loan to purchase a home, or that makes a determination in any area of criminal justice. I think companies be much more thoughtful, more deliberate, or they release a product that can be generally or widely used. And the first step towards making that happen, make sure that the training data set is representative, not have any bias that has already crept into the training data set. It makes it much more difficult to that has gone. So now, if you detect bias during training, you have to make sure that that is eliminated or it progresses to actual deployment. They go hand in hand. So that is the saying that you cannot fix something unless you know that it's broken. And the same applies for AI. When you're performing a training, you have to assume there is bias. You have to almost take it for granted that there will be bias. You have to practically work towards rooting out the bias in your training. That will be the very first step. Let's now look at a couple more recommendations. I'm going to focus on, again, on one particular recommendation on this slide, which is balancing transparency against performance. Again, there is a mad rush to make sure that performance is optimized in every conceivable area in technology these days. Everybody wants instant gratification, whether it's mortgage processing or, again, I keep going back to these two examples because they are critical. Mortgage application is really fundamental to the American dream of owning a home. That's why I keep referring to that. On the other hand, criminal justice is those who fortunately have to enter the criminal justice system, and there's the concept of fairness, even for people who have conceivably committed crimes. And that's a different area compared to mortgages, but again, that impacts directly or indirectly a lot of the American public. So that's why I keep referring back to those two examples. Now, it's critical to balance transparency against performance. So, for example, when we are processing a mortgage application, there is a customer who has walked into a bank and they're filling an application, and there's pressure on the banker to provide an immediate response oftentimes. Of course, as long as all the documentation needs are met. But as a company building those AI models, you have to have the responsibility to balance transparency against the need for instant decision making. So this goes back to the concept of some of you may be familiar with called explainable AI. Because a lot of times, especially in the examples such as mortgage application, you really don't know why your application was turned down. Maybe you have a decent credit score, but still the bank probably turned down your application, or it gave you a much higher rate than what someone else got. So how do you explain that, especially if an AI algorithm or an AI model is used in a scenario like that? So that's why explainable AI, transparent AI, those terms are becoming more and more critical. So when you're building an AI system, think about those as guardrails or your mission statement to accomplish really, which is how do you make AI system that you're building explainable? If somebody comes back and asks a question to the banker, why was my mortgage application declined? Or why did I get a rate of, let's say, 5% instead of someone else getting 3%? Same credit score. So those are areas where you really need to build in explainability in your modeling for AI. It's going to be critical as well. I want to now talk a little bit about how government can address bias in AI. Oftentimes they talk about government being almost a necessary evil when it comes to technology and its adoption. But I would think that AI is an area where you need legislation sooner or later. In fact, one could argue that government should have strict guidelines and protocols on AI, especially AI implementation matters that impact the general public. And going back to mortgage application, criminal justice. So those AI systems need to have a base standard before it can be used in making those determinations. Has to pass several fairness tests, has to pass bias tests, has to prove that those applications are not biased in any shape or form. Because the moment someone detects or submits proof that an AI system is biased, that goes against all of the AI systems that are out there. The public loses trust, there is lack of credibility, especially if it's used in areas that the government is responsible for, such as, of course, criminal justice is one of them. So you easily lose your trust in the institutions such as the judicial system and even the legislative system if those AI applications are not free of bias. So it's very critical that they are. So now, again, the other thing that government can proactively do is using public resources, making public resources available. All of us are familiar with data.gov. The government can prepare data sets or it has access to much more data than any ordinary person or private companies. It can actually provide curated data sets which are free of bias that companies can use to train their models and to build AI systems which are truly free of bias. That's another area where government intervention can really help. Now looking at how can public and companies tackle bias in AI. So any assumption that you make in an AI model, you should be able to substantiate it. But to make sure that the data is pristine, there are no data quality issues when you're building AI models. Transparency, explainable AI that we already walked through earlier. And making sure that you actually compare the training data set and the predictions with what's coming in real life. That's again balancing training data set to achieve fairness. That's going to be important. Even sacrificing some of the performance aspects of the AI models to achieve fairness and zero bias. That's going to be important as well. So to conclude, of course, all of us agree that AI is very beneficial and almost argue that it's a necessity. It's a necessity in today in many areas, and it's going to continue to be a necessity in many more areas in the future. However, there are many areas of AI that require deeper scrutiny. One of the areas, of course, the topic of today's discussion is bias. I'm hoping that through this presentation, I was able to communicate to you a very serious concern in AI applications. Concern that fortunately has been well documented, including the different types of biases that are prevalent in AI systems. Now, as data practitioners, as people into this presentation, those who are practicing data or trying to enter the data space, whether it's data science or artificial intelligence, or if you're a layman just interested in artificial intelligence in general, it's very important to know that inherently AI has bias. There's really no question about that. Because historically, there has been bias in the society. You know that people sometimes argue about the extent of bias, but nobody really argues the fact that there is inherent bias in the society in general, and it's not just restricted to any particular country. It is there in the civilized world. In most countries, there are some or other sort of bias. But coming back to the United States, when we are using AI systems to make decisions. Very important that any bias that may have crept into your training data set, any bias that has crept in because historical data already has bias. For example, going back to the example of facial recognition. Now, it's well documented that when you feed faces of criminals who have committed crimes in the past into any kind of system, including an AI system, it's possible that minorities and people of color have historically, unfortunately, if you look at the statistics, they probably have committed more crimes. Now, if you use that and that alone, or that as a critical driving factor for your AI model, and now you have a system that's established in a soccer stadium that's scanning faces of people and looking for potential threats for criminals. In that environment, it's easy to understand why there can be bias, and it's also easy to recognize the criticality of eliminating all such biases from AI applications. I believe that we, as data practitioners, we or the society, a huge responsibility. I would think that those building AI applications, they certainly have a lot of power. But as the saying goes, with power comes responsibility. You have to be responsible to make sure that you proactively address any bias issues, not after you deploy an AI application to the market. It has already made decisions for several years. It has impacted lives of a lot of people, and then you make adjustments. You don't want to wait that happens. As a responsible corporation, which really is a combination of people, so individuals in a corporation. So as responsible individuals working in a corporation that's building an application, let's promise that we will be looking for bias in AI. We will be proactively eliminating such bias. We will make sure that our training data sets are representative of the general population. We will not use AI to make decisions that can harm certain parts of the society, that can cause harm more to certain parts of society than others. So let's incorporate fairness. In criminal justice, there is a term called procedural justice. It is talking about fairness. And talk about horizontal and vertical fairness. The procedural justice is something that doesn't need to be limited to criminal justice. Broadly applied to other areas of a society as well. And I hope you join me today, pledge to work towards zero bias AI. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight. But if all of us AI practitioners, we take this pledge that we want to work towards zero bias AI, I have no doubt that it is an achievable goal. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. My contact information is here. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Thank you to all the organizers who have put together this fabulous conference, and we get to exchange ideas and learn from each other. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.